All right. All right. Thank you everyone for being here again for day 2 of our Delta Science Plan workshop. I'm just going to give a quick notice that by participating in this workshop, you consent to be recorded and your likeness or thoughts may be captured or used in Delta Stewardship Council materials. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lisamarie Windham-Myers to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Tricia. Thank you all for being here this morning. And those of you who were in person yesterday, it was really wonderful to see everyone. See if I can get these slides. Okay, so I'm Lisamarie Windham-Myers, the Delta Lead Scientist, and I want to welcome everyone to the day 2 of our Delta Science Plan workshop. It's the second of 2 days of information sharing and brainstorming that we're going to be doing together to support the development of the 2025 Delta Science Plan. Slide 2. Thank you. Yesterday, as a reminder, we heard from the plenary speaker, Dr. Sam Luoma, about what we can do to accelerate the pace of our understanding and addressing grand challenges that face our system. He gave us a sense of context so we can acknowledge these challenges, but also some successes made over the past 25 years that even make it possible for us to be at this point today. And he wanted to highlight the importance of science being appreciated in the system. And I think that's something we can all agree is a good thing for our group. After that, we actually heard from you in terms of how you're using the current Delta Science Plan and some ways that could be improved. And that was the first time we heard from you. There were several times during the days that we did. Then after that, we had a panel discussion led by Shoko Shinbrat that opened a wider discussion of opportunities to address incorporating either ways of knowing or other ways of knowing into our science enterprise. Dr. Nina Fontana from the Native American Studies Department at UC Davis was one of the panelists, as was Zach Gion from the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. And both of them illuminated with slides some really good examples of how communications and outreach can be improved to grow the science enterprise towards more useful information as we see these challenges emerging. The discussion that grew from that was just wide-ranging and very, very powerful and useful. So thank you all who engaged in that conversation. After the lunch break, we were brought back by the Delta Stewardship Chair, Julie Lee, with some welcoming words that highlighted the need and desire of decision makers to hear new ways of addressing our grand challenges. So really spurring us to do this work about addressing them. We then heard from Dr. Mark Lubell from UC Davis about Grand Challenge 3, the way our information exchange is currently limited by community structures, both between and within organizations. He talked about how those could be, how his research here and elsewhere could help point us towards better learning opportunities that can accelerate understanding. And then throughout the day, we heard from you. And so I want to say thank you again to those who were here. Being here in person was especially inspiring to me because the broad and open-ended discussions that we had around the room with big picture thinking that was still grounded by those of us scientists that are in the weeds. It really helped bring this home. And as Mark Lubell pointed out, we still need people down in the weeds for learning to happen. So I appreciated all the good feedback from the bottom to the top. I want to highlight again in the next slide the importance of that exchange. You can see here the mural exercise that we all participated in, sharing these ideas, really out of the box, big picture thinking, and the need to really feel free to drop barriers and have these conversations. Some of these ideas were also shared on Menti. So that was another way that we incorporated your insights. And the whole purpose of this is to encourage feedback and really make this a useful product for the entire Delta Science Enterprise. We had about 70 people yesterday, about half online, half in person in the room. And what we gathered from those conversations will be super useful. And I'm hoping that today spurs the same sort of out of the box, big picture thinking that helps us start to come up with actual ways of addressing the challenges rather than just reiterating that we are challenged, because it is a conflict laden system. And so we do need to find some paths forward, particularly in this time of great uncertainty. So next slide. Again, we focused on Grand Challenge 3 and 4 yesterday. Today, this numbering does not imply any sort of hierarchy, but today we're going to focus on numbers 1 and 2 and have an opportunity for discussion. I guess I will read them again just to reiterate in case folks were not on yesterday's call. The grand challenges are: number 1, scientists and managers must anticipate a world in which environmental conditions and regulations may be fundamentally different from those faced today. Number 2, environmental change is outpacing the traditional pace of science. Number 3, flows of scientific information remain decentralized and poorly connected to communities and decision makers. And 4, other ways of knowing, including traditional knowledge, remain siloed from decision making. So towards those grand challenges 1 and 2, which is our next slide, we're going to focus on, again, 2 talks to start us off, and then we'll follow that with a breakout room discussion similar to what we did yesterday. Today's speakers will be Dr. Laurel Larsen, who is the former Delta lead scientist and is an associate professor in the UC Berkeley Department of Geography and Civil and Environmental Engineering. She will be speaking on Grand Challenge 1. And then we'll hear from Dr. Lisa Wainger, who's the past chair of the Delta Independent Science Board and a research professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And she will be speaking on Grand Challenge 2. We'll then head into the breakout discussions on Grand Challenges 1 and 2. You will pick out a breakout room, and then we'll have an actual break. But then we'll return for a reporting out from what was generated during those breakouts, and then we'll also close out the workshop. And with that, I think I see that Laurel is online here. So Dr. Larsen will take over the screen and present Grand Challenge number 1. Thank you, Tricia.
And thank you, Lisamarie. It's nice to see all of you. And great to see the pictures of the room yesterday. I wish I could have been there. It seems like it was a really great opportunity for sharing. So anyway, just want to verify you could all see my slides and you can hear me?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. We are all here today because of a recognition of the challenges facing our globe, our Delta, and a desire to use the tools and framings of science to help better equip us to deal with those challenges. Thinking about this motivation reminds me of the phrase that the other side of challenge is opportunity, which is something I've always found inspiring. It's a positive and productive framing to deal with what might otherwise seem overwhelming. I just want to say that as science faces unprecedented challenges in our country today, I think it's an apt moment to try to recognize opportunities to and create a new path for the metaphorical water, if you will, of science, temporarily blocked up to flow. I appreciate this workshop because it gives us the chance to come together and do so deliberately as we chart how science will be used to address the biggest challenges that the Delta is facing. So I see this talk as a charge to highlight both the sub-challenges nested within Grand Challenge number 1, which you've been looking at here, as well as what I see as some opportunities to address this challenge. So Grand Challenge number 1, scientists and managers must anticipate a world in which environmental conditions and regulations might be fundamentally different from those faced today. And before I get into the details and the sub-challenges here, I just want to acknowledge that this grand challenge has deep roots in the work of the Independent Science Board, dating back to a memo that they sent to DPIC in 2020 in a companion paper in SFUS on preparing scientists, policymakers, and managers for a fast-forward future. And this set of works recognized that the Delta 20 years from now heck, even the delta 10 years from now is going to be very different from the delta that we're managing today. And the changes are going to be very rapid. And so science needs to be able to anticipate those changes. That's all about grand challenge number 1, and then move at a pace commensurate with those challenges, grand challenge number 2, which you'll hear about later today. But there are many potential futures for this delta. There's deep uncertainty here. And this is a topic that the current Delta Science Independent Science Board is grappling with in their seminar series on decision making under deep uncertainty and their forthcoming review. So let's get into it now. The first sub-challenge I want to talk about is that ecosystems are facing multi-stressor challenges that are not adequately addressed through current management approaches. I like to think of the delta as a complex system that's defined by many interacting components. And there's a lot of theoretical work on complex systems in physics and ecology. And one basic tenet here is that when you have these interactive effects, oftentimes what results might be really different from what you would anticipate just by knowing how individual variables impact the system. These are known as surprises in ecosystem management. And I just want to highlight a few that there are some early signals of that we might want to be aware of, just to kind of make this a little bit more concrete. And so one suite of interacting stressors that is increasingly concerning is drought, which leads to higher salinity pressures. Sea level rise is going to lead to increasing salinity in the delta, or at least an increasing need for more water releases to keep salinity at bay. And this creates important concerns for ecotoxicity. There are also many contaminants of emerging concern that are continually impacting the delta. And if you talk to people who work on ecotoxicology, they're just scrambling to keep up with the pace of the use of new chemicals in the environment. The slide that I'm showing you, or the graphics on this slide that I'm sharing with you, come from Suzanne Brander at Oregon State University. She's an ecotoxicologist funded by the Delta Stewardship Council. And the work that she's been doing suggests that under higher salinity conditions, there's more partitioning of organic contaminants like pesticides into the lipid phase. And so as you can see in this schematic picture here, there's more of these pesticides that are sorbing to fish eggs or biological tissues. And this is something that we see across a broad range of chemicals being used in the environment. So pesticide toxicity generally does seem to increase with increasing salinity, which is going to lead to mounting biological pressures on our ecosystem. Another example, staying in line with the theme of drought here, is ways in which drought, salinity, algal blooms, and fire interact. So first of all, there's a human component to this interaction. When we encounter drought conditions in our system, because salinity is such a threat, humans have decided to take action, like putting in a salinity barrier across the West Falls River, reducing exports. And collectively, these actions have the impact of increasing residence times within the Delta. And this is something that a lot of people think might be associated with a higher probability of harmful algal blooms during these periods of time. So this is one set of interacting stressors in and of themselves. But then something that adds to this is the fact that during these drought conditions, we see more fires in California and more use of fire retardants. There's a growing body of research that is looking into the impacts of this widespread use of fire retardants on various components of the environment. I just want to highlight one paper that was looking at the impacts of fire retardant concentration on green algae. And pay attention to the black dots here because these are the experiments that were done in natural waters. So green algae, which increase with fire retardant concentration, cyanobacteria, one of the constituents of harmful algal blooms, also increase with fire retardant concentration in the environment. And then there's a decrease in bacteria. So I'm going to stick with the theme of fire and drought. And just add in another potential interacting stressor here, which is that increasingly we're seeing these fire retardants and some of the products that they decompose into, making it into not just surface water, but also into groundwater. So making it into private wells. This is a fairly old paper at this point that was focused on the watershed of Sequoia National Park. And this work was showing that as the area affected by fire retardant increases, average nitrate concentration within groundwaters and surface waters also increases. Many of the fire retardant chemicals are based in phosphorus-rich compounds or nitrogen-rich compounds. And so as they degrade in the environment, they release a lot of these nutrients. Now, this is further concerning because water quality in groundwater wells already becomes very stressed during drought conditions when there's excessive rates of withdrawal and hyperconcentration of contaminants. So one of the things that we're facing is that as we look to the future and there's a higher likelihood of more frequent and more severe droughts, it is quite likely that many more wells will be taken out of commission due to contamination issues. There's increasing pressure to connect some of these groundwater dependent communities to surface water systems. And so this is something that could add to south of the Delta surface water demands that we need to be prepared for. So I've highlighted a few examples of interacting stressors. And one thing that a lot of ecologists, a lot of people in the environmental community are concerned about is this idea that when you have these multiple stressors interacting that are all causing synergistic changes, at some point the system might tip into an alternative regime. You could already think of harmful algal blooms as alternative regimes, alternative stable states, pre-bloom conditions versus toxic algal bloom conditions. But there are other types of tipping points that might impact our system as well. And of course, the one that we've gone through already has been pelagic organism decline. And so I want to just highlight a review paper that talks about these different types of tipping points that came out in environmental research letters in 2020. And one thing I like about this paper is that it emphasizes that tipping points span many aspects of social ecological systems. There are the really scary tipping points associated with global climate. A lot of times when we talk about tipping points in the Delta, we're talking about ecological tipping points, like pelagic organism decline, like regimes where we have more harmful algal blooms. But if we think about the opportunity side of this challenge opportunity coin, there are also transformation tipping points and what's being referred to as adaptation tipping points, which are social shifts in the uptake of ideas, decisions to adopt an adaptation strategy that could transform the system in a way that might be more resilient. And so some examples that we might think about of some of these other tipping points that might impact our system, positive or negative, might be a willingness for Californians to restructure water law to be more equitable. We might see large-scale farmland conversion or fallowing as we look to different climate futures. We might see a condition in which society decides to accept managed retreat in parts of the Bay or the Delta. We could also think of large-scale ecological restoration, a willingness to adopt landscape-scale ecological restoration as a potential positive ecological tipping point. So I'd like to encourage us to kind of think normatively. What are the tipping points we would like to see that would help our system become more adaptive? But then it's also important to try to anticipate some of the tipping points widely regarded as negative. So as we're thinking about science tools that can at least help us anticipate these negative tipping points, there's been a lot of work done on this in physics and ecology. And there are whole toolboxes highlighted in this paper by Dakos et al. In Earth System Dynamics that just came out this year. There are all sorts of tools that are available to look at ecological or environmental time series of data. So places where we have monitoring station data that might be indicative of the overall health of the estuary. There are these mathematical analyses you could do on these time series data that provide early warnings of potential tipping points. And, these have been shown to be very successful in hindsight. It's rare that they're used to forecast tipping points. But we have an opportunity to institute a regular practice of monitoring some of these whole system variables to look for changes that would potentially be concerning here. Now, I think there are points in time when we can institute a practice of doing this type of quantitative horizon scanning. And so some of these diagnostic tools, for example, could be incorporated into annual reporting out on Delta plan performance measures, or annual, I don't know if it's annual, it might be less frequent than that, but state of the estuary reports. But these aren't the only methods that can be used for horizon scanning. A set of qualitative methods are needed as well. And so perhaps these regular reporting intervals are also adequate times to invite a panel in that spans people from a wide range of disciplines to analyze the current state of the system, look for signals of change, and then think broadly about some of these possible futures, to think broadly about what sorts of changes these signals might be indicating. And this harkens to a call made in the Science Needs Assessment in Dick Norgaard's paper that came out in 2021, that scientists must be able to perform horizon scanning to identify future challenges not yet present within the system or currently of marginal importance within the system that might become more of a major issue later on. Okay, I'm going to go on to the second sub-challenge here, which is that science and decision makers need to communicate on both anticipated environmental and policy futures. And what I'm going to focus on in this meeting is how we might anticipate future policy decisions that could have wide-ranging impacts on the system. And this is something that I think scientists have not been great at doing up until this point. The policy realm seems a little bit mysterious to many scientists, which does argue for better communication. But I want to highlight some of the changes that might be coming that really need to be taken into account in scenario-based scientific analyses. So many of the broad protections that the Delta experiences are related to flow requirements right now that are associated with biological opinions for threatened and endangered species like Chinook salmon, winter run Chinook salmon, and Delta smelt. As we know, there's increasing pressure to relax those biological opinions, and these two species have also seen increasing pressure associated with drought in the case of winter run Chinook salmon, where we've seen previous drought decimate entire cohorts. And of course, catch of Delta smelt has been dwindling in recent years. So even though I think most of us would agree it's not at all desirable to see these species go extinct, we do need to think about possible futures where they do, and these biological opinions no longer apply. What then will provide broad-scale protections for our system? There have been recent emphases on functional flow management, such as North Delta flow actions to stimulate phytoplankton blooms. There's been a lot of work done by UC Davis Center for Watershed Studies on establishing a functional flow regime. There's also been increasing emphasis on multi-benefit solutions like wetland restoration for habitat, recreation, and salinity management. And all of this suggests that a shift towards management for ecosystem functions rather than single species might be underway. But there really needs to be more bidirectional communication between scientists and policymakers about how we continue protecting these functions in the future, particularly as our species-based protections are become increasingly uncertain. So this is a shift that requires focused and coordinated scientific efforts, not just at the scale of the Delta, but at the scale of the watershed or the estuary. And it requires understanding of drivers of food webs, cumulative effects of wetland restoration on flow, sediment, and salinity, and temperature and other water quality impacts of reservoir operations and their impacts on ecosystems, among other needs related to understanding ecosystem function. The other graphic that I have up here on this slide is just showing how it becomes exponentially more difficult to maintain low salinity in the delta under increasing rates of sea level rise. And this comes from the Delta Conveyance Project final EIR. We may face a future in which policy decisions are such that society decides it's just not feasible to maintain salinity standards in the delta, and we begin to develop regulations for a delta that is more heterogeneous and more variable. And as early as 2007, people like Jay Lund were calling for policy accommodating of this dynamic, heterogeneous, and variable delta, which carries a similar set of science needs to functional management. So these are some futures that we really need to be aware of. Another forthcoming policy change that might be likely is delta conveyance may be constructed. You may or may not approve of that, but regardless, we need to be thinking about this potential future, and we also need to be thinking about a future in which the operations of delta conveyance deviate from those that have been specified by the Department of Water Resources in order to deal with increasing pressures from sea level rise, increasing pressures from drought. So these are things that we need to anticipate. The other thing I want to mention here is that there's a widely recognized need to modernize California water law that goes back to 1977, when then Governor Jerry Brown called for a commission to reevaluate California water law. Just more recently, the Planning and Conservation League convened a task force of 8 different California water law and policy experts. And this resulted in a 2022 report with 11 different recommendations, including recommendations focused on implementing measures to support environmental and tribal justice, incorporating climate change into water planning, adjudicating water rights, and protecting fisheries and water quality within the Delta. Now, these policies or these recommendations have gained a lot of traction in the legislature, which almost immediately after this came out, proposed 4 bills that were adopted. There were 2 more that became longer term bills because they didn't see approval in the Senate. But this is, as scientists are working with managers to develop projections for the future, those projections also need to consider a wide range of California water law futures. Okay, so as I was putting this talk together, one of the things I was thinking about is, there are some futures that we might personally view as desirable or undesirable, but scientists have agency here, and scientists have agency in working with policymakers and managers. Up to this point, a lot of the way, or the way in which many scientific questions were formulated are like, if climate changes, then what happens? Or even if water allocation policy changes, what happens? This is an exploratory approach to science. It's a predictive approach to science. But in order to create a more resilient and robust and opportune future, I think what we really need is a shift in the framing of how we do science to more of a normative science. And this involves changing the way we ask questions to what is the future that we want to see if something happens, if these particular species go extinct. How do we still create a future that has features that society wants to see? So how do we get there? And this is something that requires scientists to get outside of their box and do more collaboration with social scientists and with planners. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But I think I am getting short on time. Oh yeah, I am. So I'm going to quickly go through this because Lisa Wainger is going to talk about this in much more detail. But as we're thinking about these possible futures, I think you've already gotten a sense for this, but decisions must be made under great uncertainty. And fortunately, there are many tools for dealing with this particular challenge. And I just want to highlight, first of all, what deep uncertainty is. It means talking about many plausible futures, many alternative system models, a wide range of outcomes, or even the future being unknown. We don't know what we don't know. A lot of these deep uncertainties in our system and in water resources planning span from uncertainties in projecting climate. There's uncertainties associated with emissions. There's uncertainties associated with the large degree of natural background variability in our system that are represented by different initial conditions used within these global climate models. But as you're trying to project the future in an exploratory sense, what we usually do is we link climate models that are downscaled to hydrologic models and then eventually to systems models. And there's this cascading envelope of uncertainty that expands as you go through this particular chain of models. Some people have tried to look at this quantitatively and have been finding that many of these uncertainties do stem from climate models or the particular realization representing like one trajectory of natural variability within those climate models. This is really the most impactful uncertainty in forecasting water resource futures. And I think this is something that's surprising to a lot of people that work in this field who view global climate model projections as being a gold standard, when really you need to do many realizations of those models in order to adequately capture the natural variability within the system and the compound effect of climate change with natural variability. And so one thing that's emerging as a gold standard in climate science is not just to use these GCM projections, but to train these statistical models, weather generator models, that it's a computationally efficient way to give us many realizations of a future in which there's large background variability in the signal. And this is something that helps us better constrain or define the uncertainty associated with climate change. And so as we're looking to the future, we really need both approaches to forecasting, or I'm not going to say forecasting, to projecting climate change and defining the bounds of uncertainty. And these climate traces need to be readily available in common platforms. caladapt.org is a really good start. But where I'm going with this is that in helping us to define the envelope of uncertainty in a quantitative way through a process of exploratory modeling, we really need a shared set of tools. And so the Delta Science program, I'm going to skip over this slide. So the Delta Science program has been advancing this idea of a collaboratory, which is a common set of data, tools, and knowledge. This is one example that we've been developing in a project I've been involved in called the Collaboratory for Equity in Water Allocations. But this involves, bringing people together, establishing common platforms, establishing common sets of tools and baselines that we could all work from in trying to understand an uncertain future. There would also be tools available for making for implementing standard practices and decision making under deep uncertainty, which I think Lisa will talk about. And I'm out of time, so I just want to get to my conclusions and recommendations. So as we're thinking about potential elements of the Delta Science Plan associated with this grand challenge, what I would recommend here are a set of technical tools and support for anticipating the future and doing decision-making under deep uncertainty. This includes a common set of climate and water projections via multiple approaches. We need improved streamflow models suitable for future projections. That's something I could talk about in the Q&A, as well as this other bullet point here. We need long-term funding support for participatory, co-learning, scenario-based projects. And this grand challenge focuses on, it mentions the word scientists and managers, but what's really crucial here is bringing in voices other than scientists and managers, which you had a whole session focused on yesterday. I would also recommend practicing horizon scanning at standard reporting milestones through bringing in an external panel when these annual reports are produced, or semi-annual reports are produced. We employ analytical tools for anticipating tipping points. We need to fund research that analyzes effects of interacting stressors. We need to create safe spaces for scientists and managers to communicate about future possibilities, particularly future potential policies. But there's a fine balance here between creating these safe spaces and maintaining transparency with the public wherever possible. And we need to catalyze a culture of normative science. You know, if something that many people might view as undesirable happens, how do we work within that constraint and still create a future that we desire collectively? How do we get there? And so with that, I will end this talk. Here's my contact information, and thanks for inviting me to speak to you today.
Thank you, Laurel. That was really great. We actually have a couple minutes maybe for one question, if there's a question. Yeah, Renee, go ahead and unmute.
Oh, hey Laurel, fantastic talk, and just appreciate your insights. I love the invitation that you just gave us. I'm imagining, for example, trying to use one of the salmon life cycle models that we have to contemplate actions in the context of a baseline where there were no protections from the biops. And I can just imagine the pushback that I would get doing that preemptively because of even wanting to entertain that as a possibility. And I just wondered if you have any guidance about negotiating that tension.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Renee, and it's nice to see you. Thank you. I think that pushback is real. There's always a fear when policymakers, when resource management agencies consider a scenario that includes elements that a large swath of the population will see as undesirable. And, what I would argue is that this is why we need academics and people without skin in the game working very closely with resource managers. So what we've been finding through the Co-Equal project, which is an independently led, so it's an academically led collaboratory that's being established across 6 different UCs to look at alternative scenarios for allocating water in the future. What we've been finding is that we've been hearing in our engagement a lot of strong opinions about potential policies like Delta conveyance, but people want us as an independent entity to run those scenarios because, potentially what we're doing is more trustworthy than agencies, than that of agencies with a particular mandate, with a particular mission. And so, I feel like this grand challenge number 1 has connections to a lot of the other grand challenges, and this one in particular has connections to grand challenge number 3, which is all about building these diverse networks of communication between scientists and managers. And those scientists need to come from a variety of different types of institutions. So, I feel very strongly that as we think about building a collaboratory for our Delta, it almost needs to be governed in a polycentric way, where for these very sensitive potential futures that I think we need to be considering in order to know how to deal with them if they actually happen, perhaps the leadership for that process of thinking through those futures needs to be centered on these independent, non-agency institutions like academic institutions or otherwise. Yeah, and I just, I think it's really important as we're thinking through these futures to be transparent about who is being engaged in the process, to engage people broadly and to hear from many different voices. But these are difficult things to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Renee, for that question. And thank you, Laurel, for your talk and for your really for answering that question. It was really interesting to think through these processes. And it is true that I think, when we're scoping these grand challenges, we're coming up with examples to try to differentiate them. But a lot of times the solutions or the strategies for addressing the grand challenges have a lot of overlap or can be multi-beneficial to a lot of the different grand challenges. So definitely something that I think we're all gonna experience as we get into the breakout discussions on this. So thank you again, Laurel, for that talk. And next up, we're going to have Dr. Lisa Wainger, who's going to be speaking to Grand Challenge number 2. So Lisa, you can share your screen.
Had to refine the unmute now that I've started sharing. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Laurel. That was a great coverage of Grand Challenge number 2. I think you'll see that Grand Challenge number 1, rather. I think you'll see that Grand Challenge number 2 overlaps a bit, but I think this talk will really complement what Laurel just did. So as you know, Grand Challenge number 2 is environmental change is outpacing the traditional pace of science. And I do appreciate being invited to engage on this topic with you all. So Tricia and I iterated on some major themes and came up with this. Within the Grand Challenge number 2, there's kind of 3 themes. How are we dealing with novel ecosystems? How do we define what we want, which I think Laurel covered very nicely. What types of risk assessment, modeling, and adaptive management experimentation are needed to support decisions under uncertainty? And what does innovative governance look like that enables us to be nimble? So this is a lot to talk about in 20 minutes. So I'm going to boil this down to this question. What science and management approaches help us adapt to rapid change? And what I really want to do with this talk is tell you some stories from my own experience of what I've seen work, when I've seen people effectively adapt and respond to uncertainty in useful ways. But first, I want to reiterate the themes, kind of how I think of them for this purposes of this talk. Really that getting to a place where we agree on how the system is changing and what our goals should be involves shared visioning. And I appreciate this Mark Hempel diagram, who shows you that this is not such a simple thing to get this shared vision in our heads. And I think we really need to acknowledge that. This is difficult. It's never going to be perfect, but yet if we don't have these conversations, we just keep running into challenges as we try to adapt to change. We need projections of how the system's changing and emerging signals. And when I say emerging signals, I mean it just the same way Laurel talked about it, just fundamental changes in the way systems are functioning. And I'm showing here a new typology for wetlands, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this new typology, but what struck me when I saw this figure from this paper is that it mirrored what I'd been hearing from wetland restoration practitioners about their ideas of leading indicators of when a wetland restoration will be successful. And so to this theme of, how do we get better at anticipating change, is maybe we do need to listen to some different voices, where the restoration practitioners had this goal of finding sites for wetland restoration where there was more than one type of water inflow to the system, since restoring the hydrology really determines success. And this new typology that I see is looking specifically at that, at defining locations in the stream network as a function of water inflows and frequency. And so I think we are getting there, but we need to really be thinking about what are the leading indicators. And then finally, we need nimble governance systems. And by that, I mean more than just being able to do the splits. I mean finding the ability to push against the constraints and still be innovative. And as someone who's advised a lot of government agencies, I think of this as finding just the right level of unreasonableness, right? So that people will tell you something can't be changed, something can't be done, and where do you push, and where is it most important to try to innovate? All right, now I'm going to tell you some stories. So I got involved with the Bureau of Land Management on their strategy for restoring grasslands throughout the Great Basin, but we focused in Idaho. And the challenge is the native system on the left is a mixture of species, sagebrush and grasses. And then they're struggling with invasive grasses, cheatgrass and Medusa head are shown in this picture. And you can see how the invasion really changes the landscape and reduces its habitat value, among other challenges. And we were engaged because the Bureau of Land Management was honestly trying to figure out the best way to restore, but because of a lack of trust, they weren't able to adapt. So when we came into the system, we were pleasantly surprised that they had already made some progress on a shared vision. So first of all, we need to find these sites that are burned. And I do apologize if seeing a fire right now is troubling to some people who might have experienced problems down south. But just to show that these fires make these systems vulnerable to invasion. And so there is a shared vision that we need to go into burned areas and prevent invasive grass dominance. And I just want to do a little aside here. So the details of my case studies are not going to directly apply to the Delta, but there's take-home messages, and I hope you'll be constantly thinking, how does this apply to what I work on? Because there's really underlying lessons here that are not dependent on the specifics of this situation. Okay, so they agree when to act and where to act. They agreed on the bundle of ecosystem services they were aiming to generate. So recreational hunting, forage production, sage-grouse habitat, property protection. There was agreement that these were the things they wanted the landscape to provide. Maybe people didn't agree on how to weight those things, but they did agree that was the set. Now, what they really didn't agree on were appropriate restoration techniques and site priorities, which sites to restore. So we were able to build off something that, because they had already done adaptive management experiments, they had tried different restoration techniques. They had gone out and assessed the success of these different projects, which is it's pretty unusual that people do that. And it's also pretty unusual they'd be willing to share it with outside researchers. So we were able to come in with statistical tools and test the effectiveness of their techniques using, understanding about the landscape and other variables that would be important to bring in. And so what we were able to show is what factors were tending to reduce success of restoration and enhance success. Of course, we had a mathematical model that with weights, but I'm showing it this way for simplicity. The more cheatgrass there was, the less likely you were to succeed. The bigger the fire, using only native seeds, herbicide use and drill seeding all reduced success. Enhanced success was use of fencing and remoteness and elevation, probably also a proxy for remoteness. And having lower cheatgrass enhanced success in the neighborhood of the fire. So this is important information, but we still needed to boil it down into, yes, but how do I use this in decision making? So here's the first step in that decision making. So this is a quadrant chart. We use this a lot in decision science to get at what are the major drivers of success in this case. So cheatgrass cover increasing on the x-axis, remoteness increasing on the y-axis. And if you look in the upper left quadrant of this chart, you have situations where a site might plot into low cheatgrass, high remoteness. And one of the important things we discovered with our modeling was if it was very low cheatgrass in the region, do nothing. It was likely to recover on its own. And not all community members were aware of that situation. If the cheatgrass is higher, you can have some success. You need to pick your priority sites. Now in the bottom right-hand quadrant, high cheatgrass, low remoteness, this is kind of your worst case scenario. You should also do nothing because there's almost zero possibility of success. Again, it's a hard pill to swallow, but it's what the data showed. And then in the diagonals, it's more complicated. In low cheatgrass, low remoteness, where there's going to be constant propagule pressure, our results suggested that using non-native seeds, benign non-natives, in addition to natives, was a way to help make the site more competitive with this constant propagule pressure. Obviously, that was, not well accepted by some stakeholders. but it brings up these conversations about, are we willing to start restoring for novel ecosystems? Are we willing to rethink that? And then in the upper right-hand quadrant, the probability of success was low, but it's possible you could do intensive restoration if it was a high priority site. All right, so that's where we started to deliver the results of this adaptive management experiments into the decision-making process. This shared visioning idea of, what are we doing here with restoration? We were able to do this research analysis and summarize and start to, lead them down this path of what's the vision for the future. But they still had a lot of conversations to have. And what we saw as we were presenting our results were these questions coming up about shared vision. Is restoring to novel ecosystems innovative, or is it lowering the bar? And when is it okay to adapt restoration to landscape change? So of course, I don't have all the answers here. What I can tell you is, what makes sense from a benefits and cost perspective. So, but let me put some extra nuance on that maybe you're not familiar with. So a key issue in these restoration sites is they have different probabilities of success, but they also have different sort of ultimate qualities. And how, some are just more higher priority sites because we think we can create better habitat, reduce fire risk, whatever it is. And so what we want to be able to do is compare sites that have different levels of benefits and different probabilities of success. And we want to combine those ideas. And why do we want to combine those ideas? Because of this old adage depicted here, which is a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. And I think we all get that intuitively, that a sure thing is more valuable to us than a risky thing. And so how do we weight things by this sort of discomfort we have with doing some of the riskier stuff? So this is a pretty complicated slide, and yes, there will be math, but let me walk you through it. I think you'll get it. So this is a decision tree, and it depicts how economists and decision scientists use this idea of expected value to compare different sites with different benefits and different risks. And so starting on the left-hand side, this square is your decision point. I'm going to either restore site 1 or site 2. And this is really boiling things down. It's imagining numbers you may or may not have, but I think the thinking embedded in here is still really valuable. So please bear with me. Okay. So you're just comparing 2 sites for now. Obviously, you're really comparing more than 2. And then you have a chance event, something you can't control, a new fire, propagules blowing in that you didn't expect. And so you're going to get a probability of success. In this case, on site 1, we're saying you have an 80% chance of success, and the benefits if you succeed for that, the value of the bundle of ecosystem services you'll generate will be $400,000. We have a 20% chance of failure. And that site, if you fail, will still have modest benefits of $50,000. Site 2, on the other hand, has $800,000 in benefits. This is the site you really want to restore because it's such good habitat or something like that, but it only has a 25% chance of success. And if you fail in this case, which has a 75% possibility, the site is not worth very much at all. So this is what a high risk, high return kind of project. And then to get to this expected value, what we do is multiply, I'll talk through the math, but then I'll talk through the intuition. So you have an 80% chance of getting to $400,000. You multiply those two, and then you add a 20% chance of your failure outcome. And you sum those together, you get 330 for the top site, you get 200K for the second site. And what we're saying here really is that if you rolled the dice a lot of times, if you restored the sites with the exact same conditions many times, on average, this is what you would get as your value across those sites. And so it's a way to think about, is it worth taking the risk here? And even if you don't have perfect numbers, you often have a sense of these kind of numbers. But it also raises this question of, well, can we adapt? And so, just hypothetically here, one thing that came up in this conversation was, well, what if we use some of these benign non-native seeds instead of all natives? We might reduce the ultimate benefits of the site, but we might dramatically increase the probability of success. And so in this case, even though probability is still, 0.6, not the best, but the site, potential is high, Now our expected value for this site goes from 200K to 420K, again, just hypothetically. And I think that suggests that there is some value in thinking about alternative restoration goals beside historic context, especially if you think ultimately you get more benefits from making some switches. But that's obviously a conversation that has to be had with many people and many perspectives. And that's where governance comes in. So back now to this point about how can governance systems help us adapt. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this group, Barnett et al., who I think have done some really interesting work in this regard. And they have a publication too. I'm showing their report here because it's easier to see. But they have gone ahead and gotten ahead of the of shared vision needs for climate change. They're asking questions. What will we do if? What are our priorities when? And what they're dealing with is sea level rise and increased flood risk in a coastal community. And they know because of the shape of the community, they're never going to be able to put in a seawall or anything that would really protect the community. So what they wanted to do was have some good conversations with the community using modeling, using projections and visualizations to say, look, this is what's going to happen. How should we deal with this? How can diverse community needs continue to be met? And then I think most importantly, and this is an example of dynamic adaptive planning, part of decision-making under deep uncertainty, is they had predetermined benchmarks of change that were used to motivate policy changes. So what that meant in practice is that at some level of projected flood risk, like when these severe floods are happening once every 5 years, they would decide not to rebuild, not to allow any new building. And that would be the point at which they would start to motivate retreat from the shoreline. Now, I think we all know that's a very difficult decision to come to, but they used this, thorough process. They were climate change deniers in their community group, and still they saw the logic, the common sense of moving in this direction. So I think it's promising, it's time consuming and difficult, but I think it's still something we need to work toward. And then government has a broader role in spurring innovation. And I think in my experience, it comes down to empowering employees and grantees to take some risks, giving them flexibility to explore. And one of the things that can motivate that is changing performance metrics. And I don't mean of the restoration or the programs, I mean of the employees. Because when I talk to people in organizations and I ask them what's limiting your ability to adapt, they say, well, I'm judged on this, how many publications I get out a year. That doesn't help me take risks. That doesn't help me suggest changes to the system, things like that. We need to systematically gather future signals. Laurel talked about this quite a bit, and I agree with everything she said. But the other part I want to add in is we need a pipeline from the researchers who are detecting change to the decision makers. I think that's the critical part of the system, because I think there's a lot of people out there detecting change, but how to elevate that and put it into decision processes is still weak. And then we need to explore model error for insights. And so I'm going to give you an example from the Chesapeake Bay. They did a multi-model exercise. So they had many different modeling groups do the same scenario, weather scenario projections, and see how well they could model water quality variables. And the point to meet was this X on this little X here on the bottom X-axis. So the models obviously varied a bit in their ability to predict different water quality parameters. And they learned a lot about model skill and where they might need to improve. But the most important thing is not in this article. It's something I heard from the lead modeler at the Chesapeake Bay Program Office at a workshop. And he said, when we ran the climate change scenarios, our model didn't move as much as the other models. And we took a look at what was going on under the hood, and we found that we had fixed a parameter that had worked well for 20 years, but under climate change, it was preventing us from adequately modeling temperature changes. And so it's a complex model that, this isn't a critique of the modelers. It's a very complex model, and calibrating it is challenging. So it was a reasonable thing to do when temperature regime was stable, but not now. So they learned a lot from that multi-modeling exercise. And then we really need to use scenarios to prepare for change. And we just talked about that a little bit. I want to second what Laurel said, that we need to look for more major changes, not only incremental changes, because we are biased, all of us, in our thinking, that we think change happens rather slowly and incrementally, when we have plenty of examples of really major changes happening pretty quickly. And I really appreciated those tools Laurel showed about projecting those potential major changes. All right, I'm just going to sum up now my vision of science and management that is responding to rapid change. The community is invited to discuss goals for future adaptation, that we have these really deep engagement exercises to help people understand the constraints and changes, and to really set feasible goals. Future projections and scenarios directly inform salient decisions. So I think we have a history of exploring uncertainty and running scenarios here in academia, but I don't know that we're doing such a good job translating it into, this is what it means for your decision making. This means that it's riskier to do this than you thought, and just helping decision makers really understand how to use that uncertainty in their decisions. And then restoration and management strategies are rapidly adapted to changing system variability and emerging risks. So I think, we can do this in simple ways by looking for leading indicators of what's working better or not. And then, of course, there's much more deeply analytic ways that we can project emerging risks and think about a pathway that leads us to where we want to get to, but still happens soon enough that we prevent major harm. So I'll stop there and thank you.
All right, thank you, Lisa. That was really fascinating. A lot of really interesting examples there. We have time for one question, if we have anyone with a question. And again, I really appreciate how, a lot of these answers, a lot of these solutions really do lean on bringing in the community and, talking with people who have different interests in the outcomes of what kind of decisions we make for all these different novel futures that we're managing for. Yeah, Denise, go ahead.
Lisa, thank you so much for that excellent talk. I had a question. Do you have an example of projections, that foundational knowledge about likely changes, getting to decision makers in a streamlined way? What would you say is so far is the gold standard for that?
Well, streamlined is relative when it comes to governance and complex, scientific enterprises. But I will say that I do think the Chesapeake Bay has a good model for this, where they have this sort of hierarchical system of working groups. And as science emerges, there are policymakers that listen to the science, and they choose which science seems ripe for policy change or other types of change. And there's kind of a system at which it gets elevated. So the scientists might be invited to come speak to legislators. They might be invited to come speak to the modeling group, wherever they need to fit in. And then people can, probe the science and see if it's really solid enough to actually make major changes. And I think that is kind of what we need, because if you just have every researcher has access to the highest level decision makers, you're going to overwhelm them with, my model says this, so you really need a vetting process. And it was done with other scientists and policymakers who've worked heavily with scientists, was the way it works.
I have one follow-up question. Do you see the Chesapeake Bay Collaboratory as a venue to have the science vetted and delivered? Yeah,
that's a good question. We're still really, I'm on the faculty steering committee for that, and we're still having a lot of conversations about what we do. I think that's an interesting idea. I think we should think about that. There is, like I said, already this sort of system of committees, but I think those can also be a little bit slow sometimes. So yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I'll think about that.
All right. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Denise, for that question. I am actually going to move us on to our breakouts for the morning. So we are going to be breaking out into small groups to work together on talking about strategies and tools for these two grand challenges that both Dr. Larsen and Dr. Wainger talked about this morning. So in case you were not here yesterday, I'm just going to provide a quick overview of exactly what we're talking about right now. So I just want to offer this reminder that the Delta Science Plan is this 5-year planning document for the Delta Science community. And it's really a document that is for the Delta Science program, is not really a science program product for the science program, but is informed by and for the Delta Science community. And the Delta Science Plan is sharing a vision, principles, and approaches to better coordinate science and more effectively communicate the outcomes of science activities. And so this Delta Science Plan that we're working on releasing in 2025 will be the 3rd iteration of the Delta Science Plan. And today we're going to be talking about these 2 grand challenges. I think we're all pretty well acquainted with these right now, so we can just get into the details for the breakout groups. So you're going to be placed into a breakout group that's going to be focused on either grand challenge number 1 or number 2. We have to run them concurrent because we just didn't have time for everyone to do all of the grand challenges. And what we're going to be talking about is tools, strategies, and actions to address the grand challenges. So we heard examples of what those type of tools, strategies, actions kind of look like this morning. And we're really going to be prioritizing methods or thinking about methods that can be initiated or even completed in the next 5 years, which is the duration of the 2025 Delta Science Plan. And so what are we talking about when we are talking about tools, strategies, and actions? We want people to just think really broadly and creatively. We don't really need you to get it totally perfect. We're hoping that people just put out as many ideas as they can think of, and we'll be working together to kind of talk through what everyone has put down on their sticky notes when we get into the meeting. So we are also hoping to tap into your personal experience. So what kind of connections have you had? What kind of work are you working on that is that might address the grand challenges for the Delta Science Plan? We're really hoping to hear that kind of information from you all, or even not something you're working on, but you're just interested in or know about. So each grand challenge is going to have examples from the essay that's copied into your workspace. So you might hear some common themes that you've already heard this morning. And those are just ideas to help get us the conversation started. And trying to think about like the level of strategy or tool that we're talking about. These are examples that we talked on, that Dr. Windham-Myers talked on yesterday. Things like establishing a social science task force, establishing sustainable funding for forward-looking science, and developing a web-based tracking system for science activities in the Delta. So these are like kind of planning for better science activities. The details of the breakout groups, we're going to have an assigned facilitator and note taker in your group. And we'll have groups of about 5 to 10 people. And we're going to be broken out into these breakout rooms and be working in murals. So there'll be a kind of a structured conversation here. And we're going to be in these breakout rooms until 11:20. So you'll see a breakout room pop up, and you can go ahead and click that and you'll be automatically taken to your breakout room. Look forward to our report outs. Maybe you all got a short break, if anything. If not, the rest of this shouldn't take too much more time. So I think we'll just go straight into report outs. We'll start with grand challenge number 1. We had 3 groups, and I'll start with Megan and Ash's group.
Sure, this is Ash here. I'm going to report out for our group. We discussed monitoring, how the impact of investing in remote sensing will depend on what's being monitored. And we talked a lot about how indicator species might be important to predict tipping points. Our group discussed a lot about modeling and a little bit about AI, and in particular, predicting and explaining why things are happening, not just that they're happening. It's really important to describe and understand the driver of these changes. And we discussed how there might be a disconnect between what data we need for the modelers, building the models, versus what's available. And like, for example, modelers might create models that take into account processes that are seen in unrelated ecosystems. We discussed a lot about scenario-based decision-making. We thought it would be a good idea to hold workshops for mock scenario responses to kind of plan for future responses when they actually happen. And we also discussed planning for new invasive species. In terms of communication, we talked a lot about communication. Again, we'd like to assemble response teams for unexpected events so they're ready to go, and the importance of fostering broad collaborations. We discussed the need for funding for things like apps to better visualize data and study recommendations. We would like funding for cutting edge technology and positions to facilitate those goals. And then finally, we discussed targeting new goals. So one of these examples is moving away from single species recovery goals and towards ecosystem and food web or functional goals instead. So that is what our group discussed.
Really cool. Thanks, Ash. Yeah, a lot of feel like a lot of what Laurel discussed this morning really helped spread the conversation. That's great. So next up we have Rachel and Maggie's group.
Hey everyone. Yeah, also from Grand Challenge 1. Thanks to Maggie for note taking and for everyone that participated. We had a great group. The main areas of discussion that we had here, similar to some of the things that Ash just reported out on, but we focused a lot on communication strategies for broad audiences, thinking about things like, explaining model outcomes or different scenarios that we evaluate, the importance of that communication back out to groups. We also had an interesting discussion, some ideas about kind of workforce and the people and roles and skills that we're going to be needing. So thinking about the evaluation of like doing an analysis of what subject matter experts or skills we'll need in the future. There's also an idea of like coming up with new watershed masters in certain areas as a potential approach, and investing more in current staff, thinking about hidden skills or talents. Another discussion came with reducing barriers overall, so more on the cutting green tape, and also thinking about kind of a culture shift from more reactive to proactive management. Another area was funding. So like, where's the money going to come from, either today and in the future? Do we know that? And can we kind of inform that or change that, impact that? More investments in modeling fail fast. Also just the need to maybe reevaluate our funding models and find new collaborations or partnerships, and think about accounting for this, gaps in the federal funding right now. We have 4 more areas. One was just management objectives and tools, thinking about using, social science that's really tied to management, multidisciplinary research, and other like leveraging new tools that could help us to look at evaluating kind of what restoration outcomes we want and how we're going to prioritize resources to get to that. We also talked about kind of the question of what success looks like. Again, a little bit more on this futures planning. Then the last 2, one was about monitoring. We had a lot of discussion about that. Either investing in specific monitoring, like things like for harmful algal blooms, but also new tools and investments and finding more efficiencies in monitoring, given its value. And then lastly, there was kind of a modeling and data needs, kind of a technical discussion and some ideas there, similar to yesterday, like harmonizing or standardizing publicly available data and models or model outputs, as well as, enhancing kind of existing portals we have like CDEC, and seeking more efficiencies in integrating models. And I'll offer that if anyone from Grand Challenge 3 in this group needs to correct anything I said, please jump in. But that's it. Thanks, Tricia.
All right, thank you. Yeah, a lot of similarities in how we can address these grand challenges across the grand challenges, which is really cool. So the last group for this grand challenge was Stephen and Vivian.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be reporting out. We had a really great discussion, lots of really thoughtful conversation, and so many ideas. I'll try to highlight some of the major ones. We talked a lot about the need to evaluate, understand ecosystem functions at a much larger scale than we typically have in the past. The need to operationalize that in a more cost-effective manner. And more specifically, talking about scale, we talked about re-envisioning what we mean when we talk about the delta, to think beyond just what is, the legal constraints of the delta, to think about the Central Valley, to think downstream into the Bay, to think to Southern California that receives water from the delta, because all of these places that are far away from the delta, wind up having, impacts on what we see playing out in the delta with regards to water flow, HAB, salinity, all of this stuff. It's all connected, and we were talking about the need to really think about how we can create spaces to think through as a science and management community, what it means to think across those large spatial scales. We talked about the need for better tools and long-term funding support for participatory scenario planning, and funding needs to be on longer time cycles or time horizons, because for some of these projects, it really takes time to build the relationships that are necessary to make them meaningful and effective. And oftentimes funding cycles are only for like 2 or 3 years, and that's often not conducive to building the types of relationships that are needed. We talked about the need to resist incremental changes and to sort of embrace more transformative change, and that we need to have quicker leaps as agencies in particular to move to consider things that are plausible. Right now, it takes a long time for those types of things to get mainstreamed, and we need to be able to enable more risk-taking from agencies, and agencies or institutions just need to be more open to things, their regular way of doing things breaking down, and to learn new ways of doing things. One way that we talked about this is it's just important to create venues where entities can come and show up and show up in a different way in a group setting that they would if they're just operating on their own. So creating venues for collaboration, for thinking big, and co-producing visions and strategies. And we talked about how that can be really transformative for the people that are participating in those types of venues. It can help create more buy-in for the types of strategies that wind up being produced in those types of settings. And so all of this sort of comes back to, basically the idea of a collaboratory, of a think tank. And so we talked about what could the role of the science program be in convening something like that moving forward. We thought that's really important for us to do. And, logistically, organizing something like that is sort of in line with a lot of things that the Delta Science program already does. So maybe not that high effort in terms of actually organizing a space like that, but the impact, the scale of work that we're wanting this sort of group to do is huge. So the effort on the part of this group is quite high, even if the effort of convening it may be difficult. And to really make that success, we really have to reimagine the ways that we interact with each other, and that itself is transformational and will take a lot of effort. There was a lot more that we talked about, but I'll sort of leave it there.
Great. Yeah. Wow. Fascinating conversation. Thanks, Stephen. Okay, I'm going to move right along to Grand Challenge number 2. And actually, we just had 2 teams for Grand Challenge number 2. So I'll go to Kim and Hollis first.
Hello. I'm going to report out for us. Overall in our discussion, we had like this overarching theme of just adaptability. So adaptability for individuals, for our funding, kind of collectively how we collaborate, and just like within building that adaptability into our systems. And we we based it off of like a lot of our ideas were based off of the example cluster or stickies that were already in there. But we did have a lot of discussions around increased communication, kind of like encouraging people to share preliminary results and, have more efficient and effective communication. And, have a very broad reach of how we're communicating. That way, if we're more efficient, we're more effective, more people will be on the same page and allow us to kind of move a little bit quicker. We talked about adaptive governance, and one really interesting idea that was brought up was utilizing lawyers or analysts who can determine how to change policies without having to change the regulations. So we can kind of have that adaptability to change what we're maybe studying or doing or how we're spending things. And we also talked about adding adaptive governance into people's duty statements, like making it a part of people's jobs so that they can prioritize this work and are incentivized to kind of do this work. And then that also comes along with advocating for adaptive governance to people within your workplace and showing that it is an important aspect to have in our work. We also talked about slowing the pace of change. And some ideas that came up were expanding eDNA monitoring so we can get early and rapid detections of species, prioritizing ecosystem function, future scenario, give us those early detections so we can get a jump on things. Sorry, it says my internet's unstable, so if I cut out, I apologize. We also talked about improving governance structures or the decision-making practices. So one comment was using decision scientists to translate model results into decision-relevant recommendations. And across our prioritization matrix, the ideas we sort of focused on were a lot of high impact ideas with varying levels of effort. So some of our lower effort ideas were rapid response funding, sharing wins. So when you're working with, maybe landowners who are willing to incorporate adaptive management or collaborate on that, sharing those wins to incentivize other folks to also buy into that practice can be helpful. Harnessing AI and model comparisons for future scenario evaluation if those models are already developed. And then some of our higher effort would be some of our ideas were using dynamic adaptive planning as a part of disaster preparedness and automated systems to process data and provide indicators. And then also maybe developing a task force to explore emerging signals. So those would be some of our high impact, high efforts. And that isn't all of it, but it's just a small bit of what we talked about. And that's it for us.
That's great. Thanks, Kim.
Mhm.
All right, and then we'll go to Shoko and Bree.
Great. I loved hearing that because I feel like we're having parallel, somewhat similar discussions. Yeah, and I had there was a great group of people, so really appreciate everything. And the share out is definitely not going to be comprehensive of everything we talked about. But if we think about this challenge of environmental change is outpacing science, our all of our solutions are basically one, we need to slow the pace of environmental change. So humans are often or maybe always the cause of these changes. So what is the role that we can take? And the other half is speeding up the pace of science that is communicated and impactful. So those are the two sides of that grand challenge. And then we prioritize things in terms of quick wins, middle ground, and high effort. So some of the quick wins are alternative, faster mechanisms of getting science out quickly while still maintaining for instance, a rigorous review process. Creating mechanisms for regular horizon checks, which one of the keynotes talked about, and quick funding, especially as it pertains to important issues. I think Kim also brought that up. kind of middle ground was this building trust where there is mistrust in science. So, and especially with tribes, to learn about traditional knowledge and environmental change and tipping points. This isn't particularly difficult, but it takes time. And then more adaptive governance mechanisms, which Kim already talked about. And then we have these kind of like pie in the sky, high impact, high effort ideas. So these are generating a shared vision for focusing science goals and involving all stakeholders in that visioning. And then kind of simplifying bureaucratic structures so that science can be implemented more easily, and systems-based regulations that are outcome focused. So those were just a few really good discussion. Thanks, Tricia.
Thanks, Shoko. Wow. Some really great ideas. Yeah, I just want to say before we kind of close things out that it feels like, you know, we hear kind of like the same things. We hear like there are similar or maybe synergistic solutions to a lot of these grand challenges, which I think is really empowering and like makes me feel like there are some really tangible ways that we can try to move the needle as a community forward on a lot of these different areas. So I just want to thank everyone for all their thoughts and their feedback on this process. I'm really excited to dig into all of the mural boards later as we get into the next phase of writing the Delta Science Plan. And I didn't miss any one, right? Should have gone to all 5 groups. Okay. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this out for the day. So the next steps from here, all these discussions and the Menti that we did yesterday, we're going to be taking all this information and really trying to synthesize it down into the meat of the Delta Science Plan as we move forward. Like we've been talking about, there are a lot of these solutions or these actions that we might take do seem like they're very multi-beneficial across, you know, we can just like do some of the work to really move the needle along for a lot of different grand challenges. And as we're working on developing the Delta Science Plan, we're going to be taking this information in and really hope to use this as a way to gauge what's most important to all of you, the Delta Science community. The draft science plan, we're anticipating to be out in early fall of 2025, and there will be a public comment period associated with that so that the final science plan will be out later this year. And with that, if you feel like there's anything else you wanted to provide or a point that you really wanted to reiterate, we're definitely open to hearing any additional points from here on out. But with that is the end of our science plan workshop. And I want to just thank you all again so much for your participation.
Thanks, Tricia.
Thank you,
Tricia. Thank you, everyone.
Yay.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.